Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good evening, Mr. Speaker.
Good evening, sir.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, to the good proponent of the bill.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, could you give us a list of situations, maybe, where this information, which right now is not available, it is necessary for that information to be available? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's an excellent question. That's really been the subject of the conversation with all the parties. What is the appropriate data for sharing? A lot of it has to do with water availability, amounts of water, particularly as it applies to its various uses. It also may apply to some aspects of water quality, stream flow, groundwater, things of that sort, because those are the sources of water that need to be made available for all the different uses of the state. And what we really require is longitudinal data over a period of time to see changes so that we can plan accordingly as our uses change and as our supply may change with other changes going on related to climate change or other reasons. You know, we've always been a fairly water-wealthy state, but we've seen in recent years we must plan for our future. This would facilitate the planning process that's currently underway. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, so as I'm hearing you, the general public, if I understand this bill, can request certain information, and that information, because of what we passed through this evening, and maybe when it becomes law, that information which currently is not available will be made available to individuals. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct. Currently, their access to the data is limited by the existing FOI law. This is making changes so that we can clearly segregate things they shouldn't have, but make accessible data they can have. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, would we be separating out as to who is requesting this information? Is it anybody in the general public, you, me, or anyone else? Or is it somebody who's involved in the process and is making decisions depending on what this various information they get, like an agency or some other people? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you. FOI requires that it be available to the general public, but practically speaking, this data would only be useful to those who are using it for planning purposes or monitoring certain bodies of water. The general public would probably not find the data useful, except that it should be available in terms of being general information that does not need to be secure for security risks. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, would this information also include drought conditions as to what are the levels will it be, at what point in time water can be used for other purposes, like, for example, for bottling of water, or so on and so forth? Is that where an agency or an advocacy group may use this information? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. New Speaker. Yes, that's precisely the kind of uses that might occur, is to understand the availability of water for a variety of purposes, whether it's drought conditions or other commercial or recreational uses. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan, please.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. So, as I understand this, for this freedom of information, anyone and everyone can request this information, but the likelihood of this information being requested will be by agencies and advocacy groups that may have a reason as to why they need all these data. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Steinberg, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through yes, that is correct. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan, please.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Public Health had some reservations, and then they agreed upon moving this bill forward. Through you, Mr. Speaker, what were the concerns for the Department of Public Health? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I think the Department of Public Health was most concerned about water data that applies to their responsibility for water safety, quality of water, potable water, and things of that sort. That was their concern. But there were a number of interested parties. The Department of Administrative Services, which has responsibility for administering a lot of the FOI requests, had interests. The water utilities wanted to make sure this was something reasonable that they could manage. And the environmental groups that were the most likely ones to use this data, those who were involved in the water planning process, were also very interested. So this is really an understanding between all the interested parties, and we're very pleased they came to this understanding. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan, please.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the big concern that was raised, and I wanted to keep it to the end of my discussion, the big concern that was raised by groups and all of us, and as you mentioned early on in the presentation of this bill, is if this information were to fall, quote unquote, into the wrong hands, and could there be the possibility then that we could be opening up this information and expose ourselves to terrorist groups or some other organizations who do not have our best interest? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
To you, Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, that is an excellent question. That really speaks to the heart of why this was a tough bill to negotiate in some ways. We wanted to make absolutely sure that data that would be of high value or risk would not fall into the wrong hands. In fact, the water companies, when they submit their water plans, will submit a complete plan, but they'll also submit a redacted plan where all the data that should not be shared is supplied, and that would be the document that would be shared via FOI, so there could be no such mistake. Through you.
Thank you, Representative. To you, Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, when a plan is submitted, that plan would have parts of the plan that it will be okay for us to send it out or give it out to people if it is requested. And at the same time, parts of the plan that we are concerned about, that if it were to fall into wrong hands, could lead to negative consequences as far as our state is concerned, that information, A, is redacted, and that information will not fall into these hands. That is our primary concern. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, that is absolutely correct. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, my final question is that if somebody requests this information under the Freedom of Information Act, and we feel that that information should not be given to them because it is a redacted part of the plan, could they then come after us as a state or any of us and say that how come, according to the Freedom of Information Act, this portion of the bill or that information was not given to us? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another good question. That's why this is so rigorous. We have been explicit about the data sources that cannot be shared, and that is in statute. It is consistent with FOI because of the security risk component, so we would not be liable for being challenged on that. And there's also a process if there be an area of data that which we had not anticipated, or if technologies or circumstances change, there is an appeal process to make sure that data is also not made available. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to thank the good chair for answering all these questions and clarifying some of the concerns that some of us in the chamber may have. And I definitely feel, having had the opportunity to work so closely with him and on these various components of the bill, that this information that is requested has to be given through the Freedom of Information Act. At the same time, we do not need to be concerned that that's information that should not fall into certain hands. They will have access to that. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to adopt this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.